What if I told you that almost everything you think you know about the men on your money is wrong? Not in some dramatic, torn from the headlines way. Nothing here is going to make you angry. But the marble version of the Founding Fathers, the one you met in a grade school textbook, the one carved into monuments and printed on the $1 bill, that version is mostly a mix of myth, marketing, and things somebody made up long after everyone involved was safely dead. And once you start pulling on those threads, the real story turns out to be stranger, quieter, and a great deal more human than the legend. Here's the thing. Over the next little while, I'm going to walk you through 99 things that people confidently believe about the Founding Fathers. Things you were taught, things you've repeated, things you'd swear were true, and I'm going to gently show you why each one is wrong. Not to embarrass anyone, not to knock these men off their pedestals. Just to set the record a little straighter, one small correction at a time. 99 myths, misquotes, and schoolbook legends, each one quietly traded for the actual documented history. And before we begin, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button. Give this video a like. The algorithm doesn't love quiet history. It wants shouting and outrage, and we're not going to give it any. So the little tap of a like button is how these calm corners of the past find the people who need them. It only takes a second, and then you never have to think about it again. Now, get comfortable, settle into the pillow, dim the lights, or let the screen go dark entirely. You don't need to watch anything. This one's for listening, for drifting. Let me tell you a little about where we're headed without giving too much away. You've probably heard that George Washington had wooden teeth. He didn't. Not a splinter of wood in his mouth, and the truth about what he actually wore is far more unsettling. You've heard, maybe, that Benjamin Franklin wanted the turkey to be America's national bird, that he lobbied for it, fought for it, lost to the eagle. That didn't happen either, and the real story is a joke Franklin made in a letter to his own daughter. You know the tale of Little George and the cherry tree, and I cannot tell a lie. That was invented by a traveling book salesman. And somewhere in your memory, there's Paul Revere galloping through the dark, shouting, "The British are coming." He never said those words. He couldn't have. It would have given the whole thing away. We'll get to all of them. The wooden teeth, the turkey, the cherry tree, the midnight ride, and 95 more besides. The crown Washington supposedly turned down. The declaration that wasn't signed on the 4th of July. The quotes these men never actually said, now stitched onto posters and shared 1,000,000 times a day. Slowly, calmly, one after another, we'll take the story you were handed and lay the truer one down beside it. And I want to be clear about something, because it matters. This is not a hit piece. We're not here to tear these men down or to sneer at the past from the comfort of the present. The founders don't need me to defend them, and they don't need me to prosecute them either. They were people, brilliant, flawed, contradictory people, capable of writing that all men are created equal and then going home to an estate run on the labor of the enslaved. The myths flatten them into saints or statues. The truth gives them back their edges. And honestly, the real version is the better story. It always is. So there's nothing to brace for here. No twist that's going to jolt you awake. Just a long, easy walk through the strange and tangled history of how a scattered group of 18th century men became the polished legend we grew up with, and everything that got lost, smoothed over, or simply invented along the way. 99 of them. We'll take our time. There's no rush, and no test at the end. Let your shoulders drop, let the day go, and let's begin where the legend almost always begins, with the man on the dollar bill himself. Myth number 1. George Washington had wooden teeth. It's one of the first things anyone learns about him, and it's completely false. There was never any wood in Washington's mouth. What he actually wore by the end of his life was a set of dentures assembled from a genuinely startling list of materials: ivory, carved from hippopotamus and elephant tusk, along with gold wiring, brass screws, small springs and lead, and teeth, real teeth. Some came from animals, some uncomfortably were human, pulled from other people, including, records suggest, from enslaved people at Mount Vernon. A 2005 study using laser and spectroscopic scanning at the National Museum of Dentistry confirmed all of this and found no trace of wood at all. So where did the myth come from? Most likely from the way the ivory aged. Over time it stained and darkened, developing fine hairline cracks, until the surface took on a grainy, brownish look. To anyone glancing at it, it looked like wood. The reality was far more expensive and far more grim. But it was never lumber. Myth number 2, and this is the one they put in the picture books: Young George and the Cherry Tree. As the story goes, a small boy chops down his father's prized cherry tree with a hatchet, and when confronted, cannot bring himself to lie. "I cannot tell a lie," he says. "I did cut it with my hatchet." A perfect little parable of honesty. Here's the thing: it never happened. There is no record of it anywhere in Washington's lifetime, not in his papers, not in a letter, not in a single account from anyone who knew him as a child. The tale first appeared in 1806, 7 years after Washington died, in a wildly popular biography written by a traveling preacher and bookseller named Mason Locke Weems. Parson Weems, as he styled himself, knew exactly what the grieving public wanted: a saint. So he gave them one, complete with edifying anecdotes he seems to have simply invented. The cherry tree sold beautifully. It was fiction from the start. That brings us to number 3, the story that Washington, as a strong young man, threw a silver dollar clear across the Potomac River. Picture the width of the Potomac at Mount Vernon, better than a mile across in places. No human arm has ever thrown a coin that far, and no human arm ever will. The physics simply don't allow it. And there's a second problem, a quieter one. Silver dollars weren't in circulation during Washington's youth. The coin as we know it didn't exist yet, so he couldn't have thrown one because he never had one to throw. The tale probably grew out of something smaller and more believable. His step-grandson recalled Washington throwing a stone across the much narrower Rappahannock River near his boyhood home. Over the years, a stone became a coin, and a small river became a great one. That's how legends tend to grow, a little at a time. Number 4 is a big one: the idea that Washington could have been king, that he was offered a crown and nobly refused it. There was no crown. No formal offer ever existed, no assembly, no faction, no letter proposing that Washington be made monarch of America. What did happen was subtler and honestly more impressive. In 1783, with the war winding down, some of his own officers, unpaid and bitter, began circulating the idea of marching on the government, the Newburgh Conspiracy. Washington walked into their meeting and quietly talked them out of it. Then, at war's end, he did the thing that stunned the world. He handed his sword back to Congress and went home to his farm. He gave up power when he could have kept it. That's why they called him the American Cincinnatus, after the Roman who returned to his plow. No king ever does that. That was the whole point. Number 5. Washington was the first man ever to hold the title President of the United States. Not quite. Under the Articles of Confederation, the country's first, wobbling framework, in place before the Constitution, the young United States already had presidents. Not presidents of the country, but presidents of Congress, men who presided over the assembly. Several held the office. One of them, a Marylander named John Hanson, served a full term and is sometimes cheerfully, if loosely, called the first president by people who enjoy a bit of trivia. The distinction is real, though. Washington was the first president of the United States under the Constitution, the office we mean today, with actual executive power. But he wasn't the first American ever to answer to the word president. The title had been quietly floating around Philadelphia for years before he took his oath in 1789. A small thing. But it's the kind of small thing this whole story is made of. Number 6. Washington was a cold, austere loner, a childless man with no family warmth in him. The childless part has a grain of truth, and a sad one. Washington fathered no biological children of his own. Historians think an illness in his youth, possibly smallpox or tuberculosis, may have left him unable to. But the picture of him as some solitary marble figure with no family is simply wrong. When he married the widow Martha Custis, he took in her 2 young children from her first marriage and raised them as his own. When her son later died young, Washington and Martha raised 2 of the grandchildren too. His letters show a man genuinely tender toward these children, indulgent, worried, affectionate. He was, by every account, a devoted stepfather and grandfather. He may have looked stern in his portraits. That tight, unsmiling face was mostly the dentures. Behind it was a house full of children he loved as if they were his blood. Number 7 asks us to slow down and be careful, because the truth is uncomfortable. The belief that Washington, out of pure conscience, freed the people he enslaved during his lifetime. He did not free them in his lifetime. Washington enslaved people at Mount Vernon for decades, and he grew privately troubled by it in his later years. That much the records support. But the freedom came only through his will, and only in careful, delayed steps. His enslaved people were to be freed after Martha's death, not his own. And there was a legal knot he could not cut. Many of the enslaved people at Mount Vernon were dour slaves, tied to the Custis estate, and Washington had no lawful power to free them at all. They remained in bondage, so it's true he was the only slaveholding founder to free his own enslaved people by his will. It's also true that it happened after his death, on a delay, and left many others still enslaved. Both of those things are the history. Number 8. Washington, kneeling alone in the snow at Valley Forge, praying for his freezing army. It's a powerful image, the general on his knees in the white silence, hat off, head bowed. It hangs in churches, it's been painted, engraved, stitched into stained glass. And there is no contemporary evidence that it ever happened. Not one account from anyone actually at Valley Forge that terrible winter describes it. The suffering at Valley Forge was painfully real, the cold, the hunger, the men without shoes. But the praying in the snow scene appears nowhere until, once again, Parson Weems, that same industrious storyteller, put a version of it into print years after Washington's death. Whether Washington prayed privately, we can't know. He was a man of conventional faith, who kept it mostly to himself. But the famous frozen tableau is devotion invented for us, later by people who needed him to look a certain way. Number 9 is a quick one, and gentle. The white powdered wig. Look at any portrait, the neat white curls above the collar, and you'll assume, as nearly everyone does, that Washington wore a wig. Plenty of gentlemen of his era did, but he didn't. That was his own hair. He wore it long, pulled back into a queue and tied behind, and then powdered white in the fashion of the day, the way a man might now put a little product in his hair before a photograph. The white came from powder. The hair was his, reddish-brown underneath, going gray as the years passed. A small vanity, honestly relatable. He was keeping up appearances like the rest of us. And that carries us to number 10, which quietly undoes the last illusion. The image of Washington is a robust, iron-healthy giant of a man. He was tall for his time, yes, and physically imposing in his prime. But healthy? Washington spent much of his life unwell. He survived smallpox, malaria, dysentery, pneumonia, and a throat infection that nearly killed him. And through all of it ran the endless, grinding misery of his teeth, decades of aching, rotting, and extraction, until he had almost none of his own left. Those famous dentures didn't fit well. They pushed his lips outward and forced his jaw into a stiff, clamped set. That tight-lipped, faintly pained expression on the $1 bill. That's not solemn dignity. That's a man in real discomfort, holding a mouthful of ivory and laid as still as he can. He endured a great deal, quietly, which makes him rather easier to like. From the man on the dollar bill we drift, naturally, to the man on the 100, the oldest, wisest, most quotable of them all, and the one saddled with more cheerful misinformation than anyone. Myth number 11. Benjamin Franklin fought long and hard to make the turkey America's national bird instead of the eagle. It's a charming picture, the wise old printer arguing for the humble, homely turkey, while everyone else swooned over the majestic eagle. And it's mostly a misunderstanding. Franklin never made any such proposal. What he actually did was write a private letter in 1784 to his daughter Sarah, grumbling about the eagle on the newly designed seal. He called the bald eagle a bird of bad moral character, a lazy thief that steals food from other birds, and offered, half joking, that the turkey was at least a bird of courage and a true original native of America. It was a wry aside in family correspondence, not a speech, not a motion, not a campaign. The eagle, meanwhile, was chosen after a long, 6-year wrangle over the Great Seal, finally settled in 1782, 2 years before Franklin's letter. So he wasn't lobbying to change anything. He was just an old man being funny on paper. It's real. You can read the letter. From one bird to a bolt of lightning. Myth number 12, the big one. Benjamin Franklin discovered electricity. He didn't, and he never claimed to. Electricity had been known, in one form or another, for a very long time. The ancient Greeks noticed that rubbing amber attracted bits of straw. The very word electricity comes from the Greek for amber. By Franklin's day, European experimenters were already storing electrical charge in glass jars and shocking one another at parties for entertainment. What Franklin did was study it seriously, describe it carefully, and give us much of the vocabulary we still use: positive and negative, battery, conductor, charge. And crucially, he demonstrated that lightning and the spark in the laboratory were the same thing. That was the leap, not discovering electricity, but proving the sky was full of it. A subtle distinction, but an important one. He organized the mystery. He didn't stumble on it, which brings us naturally to number 13. The image of Franklin out in the storm, kite in hand, getting struck by a bolt of lightning and living to tell the tale. Here's the thing. If Franklin had actually been struck by lightning, we would not be telling stories about him. We'd be laying flowers. A direct strike would almost certainly have killed him. That was rather the point of his caution. In the famous 1752 experiment, the kite was not hit by lightning at all. The idea was subtler and safer. The kite drew a faint electrical charge from the storm-heavy air, which traveled down the wet string to a metal key, and Franklin, standing under cover with the dry end of the line, drew small sparks from that key. He kept himself insulated. Even so, historians still argue about exactly how, or even whether, the experiment happened as later described. Much of the account comes second-hand, from Joseph Priestley, 15 years afterward. What we can say is this: the man was careful. He knew precisely how dangerous the thing in his hands really was. Number 14 is one of those quiet mix-ups people carry for years without noticing. The belief that Benjamin Franklin was, at some point, President of the United States. He wasn't. Franklin held nearly every other role you could name: printer, postmaster, diplomat, delegate, inventor, but he was never president of the country. The confusion, if it comes from anywhere, comes from a real title he did hold: President of the Supreme Executive Council of Pennsylvania. That was the top office in Pennsylvania state government at the time, a kind of governorship, and he served in it in the mid-1780s in his late 70s. So he was a president of Pennsylvania, not of the United States. He died in 1790, at the very start of the new government under the Constitution, with George Washington in the national chair. Franklin never sought that chair, and never sat in it. Staying with things Franklin supposedly gave us, number 15. The idea that Benjamin Franklin invented daylight saving time. He did write about it, and that's how the myth took root. In 1784, living in Paris, Franklin published a light, satirical essay imagining the money Parisians might save on candles if they simply got out of bed earlier and used the morning sun. He suggested, tongue firmly in cheek, that the city might fire cannons at dawn and tax window shutters to rouse the late sleepers. It was a joke, a gentle poke at the fashionable habit of sleeping past noon. He was not proposing that anyone move the clocks. Clocks weren't standardized enough for that idea to even make sense yet. Daylight saving time as an actual policy didn't arrive until well over a century later, during the First World War. Franklin gets the credit because he was funny about it first. Not that anyone asked him to be. Number 16. Benjamin Franklin wrote the Declaration of Independence. He didn't write it. That was Thomas Jefferson, who produced the draft over about 17 days in June of 1776. Franklin was on the committee assigned to the task, the Committee of Five, and his role was that of a trusted elder editor, not an author. The most famous change credited to him is a small, sharp one, where Jefferson had written that certain truths were sacred and undeniable. Franklin is thought to have suggested self-evident instead. A better phrase, and it stuck. Beyond a handful of touches like that, the words are Jefferson's, and then Congress's, since the delegates cut and altered a good deal of the draft before adopting it. Franklin signed the finished document, as he signed nearly every founding paper of that era. But he did not write it. He improved a line or two and let the younger man have the pen. Number 17 turns the whole picture on its head. We tend to imagine the founders as young revolutionaries, and Franklin along with them, a firebrand in the prime of life. Franklin was old. By the summer of 1776, he was around 70 years old, easily the oldest man to sign the Declaration, older than most of the others by a full generation. Many of the delegates were in their 30s and 40s. Jefferson was 33. Franklin had already lived an entire public life, as a printer, a scientist famous across Europe, a colonial agent in London, before the Revolution even began. By the time he helped negotiate the peace with Britain and, later still, sat in the Constitutional Convention of 1787, he was in his 80s, frail, carried in at times in a sedan chair. He was not the young hothead of the group. He was the grandfather of it, the one who had seen the most and had the least left to prove. Number 18 is, quietly, one of the more admirable facts about him. The assumption that Franklin patented his inventions and grew rich from them. He invented a great deal: bifocal spectacles, the lightning rod, a cleaner and more efficient heating stove that still bears his name, and more. And he patented none of it, not one. This was a deliberate choice, and he explained it plainly. Having benefited so much from the inventions of others, he wrote, he felt he should share his own freely and generously. When the governor of Pennsylvania offered him a patent on his stove, Franklin turned it down. He believed useful ideas belonged to everyone, and that a man who spent his life chasing credit and royalties would miss the greater reward of simply being useful. He could have died far wealthier than he did. He chose not to. And that's the part everyone forgets. Number 19. That perfect ringing line, "A republic if you can keep it," the one Franklin supposedly delivered as he left the Constitutional Convention. As the story goes, a woman stops Franklin outside Independence Hall in 1787 and asks what kind of government the delegates have given the country. "A republic," he answers. "If you can keep it, it's a wonderful quote. It may even be true, but it rests on remarkably thin evidence, a single second-hand note in the diary of James McHenry, a Maryland delegate, who wasn't necessarily standing there, and was writing down what he'd heard. There is no other contemporary record of the exchange, no confirmation from Franklin himself, nothing to tell us whether the words were exact or smoothed over in the retelling. It's the kind of line that's almost too neat, too quotable, to fully trust. Maybe he said it just that way. Maybe the good phrase grew a little in the telling, as good phrases do. And that brings us, gently, to number 20, the belief that Benjamin Franklin was a devout Christian. He wasn't, at least not in the way the word usually means. Franklin was a deist. He believed in a creator and in doing good, but he was openly skeptical of the specific doctrines of Christianity. In a letter written just weeks before his death, at the age of 84, he was remarkably candid about it. He said he had doubts about the divinity of Jesus, whose system of morals and his religion he thought the best the world ever saw, but whose godhood he had never quite been able to accept, and then added, with a wink you can almost hear, that he expected he'd learn the truth soon enough with less trouble. What Franklin valued in religion was its usefulness. He thought it helped people behave decently toward one another. But he prayed to no particular creed, sat in no pew with real conviction, and reasoned his way to the end on his own terms. A believer in something, just not the thing we usually assume. From Franklin's Philadelphia, our story drifts a little south to a red brick mountaintop in Virginia and the tall, quiet redhead who built it. Myth number 21. Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence single-handedly, alone at his desk, pouring out the nation's founding words in one inspired burst. He wrote most of the draft, yes, but he was assigned to it. In June of 1776, the Continental Congress appointed a committee of 5 to prepare the document: Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston. The committee handed the writing to Jefferson, partly because Adams thought him the better prose stylist, and partly, Adams admitted, because a Virginian ought to lead. Franklin and Adams then made small edits before it went to the floor. And then Congress got hold of it. Over 2 days of debate, they cut, trimmed, and reworked roughly a quarter of what Jefferson had written, including a long passage he cared about deeply. He sat through it, by all accounts, quietly miserable, watching his sentences get shortened. The soaring document we revere is his voice, refined by a committee and edited by a Congress. Authorship, in the end, was a group effort that brings us to number 22, and here we have to slow down. The belief that Jefferson, troubled by slavery, freed the people he enslaved. He did not. Over the course of his life, Thomas Jefferson enslaved somewhere around 600 human beings. At any given time, more than 100 lived and labored at Monticello, growing his crops, building his house, cooking his meals, and making the nails he sold. And in all those decades, he freed only a handful, around 10 people, most of them members of a single family, the Hemingses. 2 he freed during his lifetime, a few more in his will. Everyone else remained enslaved, and after his death, most were sold to pay his debts. This is the same man who wrote that all men are created equal, who called slavery a moral depravity, who said in a chilling phrase that keeping it was like holding a wolf by the ears. He knew. He wrote about knowing, and he kept holding on. Staying at Monticello a moment longer brings us to number 23. The idea that the relationship between Jefferson and Sally Hemings is baseless gossip, a smear invented by his political enemies. For nearly 2 centuries, that's how it was treated. The story surfaced in Jefferson's own lifetime, in a hostile newspaper, and defenders waved it away as slander for generations. But the evidence kept accumulating, and in 1998, a DNA study compared descendants of the Jefferson line with descendants of Sally Hemings' youngest son, Eston. The results showed a Jefferson male fathered him, combined with a documented record that Jefferson was present at Monticello 9 months before each of Hemings' known children was born, that she conceived none while he was away. The historical consensus shifted. The Thomas Jefferson Foundation, which runs Monticello, now states plainly that he was the father of her children. Sally Hemings was enslaved, roughly 30 years younger than Jefferson, and the half-sister of his late wife. This is not a love story, it is history, and it is finally being told honestly. Number 24 steps into gentler, stranger territory. The assumption that Jefferson was an Orthodox Christian, devout in the conventional sense. He wasn't, and he'd have told you so. Jefferson was a product of the Enlightenment, a deist who admired the moral teachings of Jesus but flatly rejected the supernatural parts, the virgin birth, the miracles, the resurrection. He thought them later embellishments layered over a good man's philosophy. So, being Jefferson, he did something remarkable about it. Late in life, he took a razor to several copies of the New Testament and physically cut out every verse he considered credible, the teachings, the parables, the ethics, and pasted them together into a slim volume, leaving all the miracles on the cutting room floor. It ended at the tomb, with no resurrection. He called it the Life and Morals of Jesus of Nazareth. We call it the Jefferson Bible, a founding father, quietly editing the Gospels with scissors at his desk. It's real. You can see it in the Smithsonian. Number 25 is a matter of simple geography. The belief that Jefferson, that towering founder, signed the Constitution? He didn't sign it. He couldn't have. He was on the other side of an ocean. In the summer of 1787, while 55 delegates sweated through the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, Jefferson was in Paris, serving as the United States Minister to France. He never attended a single session. What he knew of the debates came by letter, mostly from his young friend James Madison, who kept him informed across the Atlantic. Jefferson had opinions, of course. He worried about the lack of a Bill of Rights and about presidents serving over and over, and those letters nudged the final shape of things. But his name is nowhere on the document. The 2 founders most fused in the public mind with American liberty, Jefferson and Franklin, and one of them was in France for the writing of the Constitution entirely. From geography to philosophy, number 26. The reading of all men are created equal as proof that Jefferson believed wholeheartedly in the equality of all people. The phrase is luminous, the man who wrote it is harder. Jefferson penned those 5 words while owning other human beings, and he never resolved the contradiction, not on paper, not in his life. Worse, in his one full-length book, Notes on the State of Virginia, he set down speculations about black people that were, frankly, ugly. He suggested they might be inferior to white people in body and mind, as a suspicion only. Historians still argue over how much he meant it and how much he later softened. But the plain fact is that the author of humanity's most quoted line about equality also wrote passages doubting it. The words outran the man. That's part of why they've mattered so much. Later Americans, from abolitionists to the marchers of the 20th century, held Jefferson's own sentence up to the country and demanded it be made true. And now, number 27, the delightful exception. Because usually on this list, the too perfect legend turns out to be false. This time, brace yourself, it's true. The story goes that Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, the two old revolutionaries, once dear friends, then bitter rivals, then friends again by letter in old age, died on the very same day. And not just any day. They both died on the 4th of July, 1826. The 50th anniversary to the day of the Declaration of Independence they had brought into the world together. It sounds like something a sentimental novelist would be too embarrassed to write. But it happened. Adams passed that afternoon in Massachusetts, 90 years old, reportedly murmuring Thomas Jefferson survives, not knowing that Jefferson had already died a few hours earlier at Monticello, some 500 miles away. Two founders, 50 years to the day. History, every so often, writes an ending no one would believe. Number 28, Jefferson, the tireless inventor, the man who gave us the swivel chair, the dumbwaiter, and a whole catalog of gadgets. He was genuinely curious, endlessly tinkering, one of the most inventive minds of his age. But the word invented gets stretched pretty thin. That famous swivel chair, he improved an existing design. The dumbwaiters at Monticello? Small lifts for wine already existed in Europe. He adapted them. He refined a moldboard plow, popularized a copying device called the polygraph, and filled his house with clever mechanisms. What he almost never did was invent something from nothing. And here's the tidy irony. Jefferson didn't even believe in owning ideas. As the man who oversaw the early patent system, he argued that ideas, once shared, belonged to everyone, that they spread like the flame of one candle lighting another, diminishing no one. So he patented not a single thing, which makes calling him the inventor of this and that a little unfair to him in both directions. Number 29 follows the money, and the money runs out. The picture of Jefferson as a grand Virginia planter, comfortably wealthy to the very end. He looked wealthy. He lived wealthy. Monticello, the wine, the books, the constant building and rebuilding. But underneath it, Jefferson was drowning. He inherited debt, married into more, spent lavishly, co-signed a friend's loan that collapsed on him and never once got out from under it. By the time he died on that famous 4th of July in 1826, he owed the modern equivalent of roughly $2 million. His family couldn't hold on. Monticello was sold. His possessions were sold. And the enslaved people of Monticello, the men, women, and children whose labor had built and sustained the whole illusion, were auctioned off to satisfy his creditors, families broken apart in the process. The author of American Independence died dependent on debts he could never repay. The mountaintop mansion we tour today was, in a real sense, insolvent, which leaves us, at last, at number 30. The Jefferson of legend as the pure small government purist, the man who wanted federal power kept tiny, and the Constitution read strictly word for word. That was his creed, absolutely. He built a whole political movement on it, suspicious of central power and loyal to the letter of the founding document. And then he became president, and reality arrived. In 1803, Napoleon suddenly offered to sell the entire Louisiana territory, nearly 1 million square miles, doubling the size of the country, for about $15 million. The Constitution said nothing about a president buying vast foreign lands. By his own strict standards, Jefferson had no clear authority to do it. He privately fretted that he was overstepping, even mused about needing an amendment. Then he did it anyway, because the deal was too extraordinary to pass up. The greatest land purchase in American history was made by the man who most distrusted stretching the Constitution, stretching it himself. Even the purists, it turns out, bend when the map is on the table. Thomas Jefferson gave us the words. What most of us remember wrong is nearly everything about the paper he wrote them on, and the holiday we built around it. Myth number 31, and it may be the most stubborn of them all. The Declaration of Independence was signed on July 4, 1776. It wasn't. What happened on July 4 was adoption. The delegates of the Continental Congress approved the final wording of the document that day, and that's the date printed across the top of it, which is exactly why the myth sticks so well. But approving the text and signing the parchment were two different acts. separated by weeks. The famous engrossed copy, the big handsome one with all the signatures, wasn't even ready on the 4th. Most of the delegates put their names to it on August 2, 1776, nearly a month later, gathering to sign the formal copy once it had been carefully written out. So the moment you picture, quills scratching, signatures flowing, on Independence Day itself, is off by about 4 weeks. July 4 is the birthday of the words. The signing came later, quietly, in August, which leads straight into number 32, a close cousin of the last one. That independence itself was declared on the 4th of July. Here's the thing, the actual vote for independence happened on July 2, 1776. That was the decisive act, the moment the Continental Congress resolved that these united colonies were, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. July 4 was when they finished editing the document explaining that decision. The break had already been made 2 days earlier, and we know exactly how one founder felt about it, because John Adams wrote to his wife Abigail the very next day, on July 3, predicting that July 2nd would be the most memorable epoch in the history of America, celebrated by future generations with parades, bonfires, and fireworks. He had the celebrations exactly right. He just had the date wrong by 2 days. The country ended up throwing its party for the paper, not the vote. Adams, it said, never quite forgave the calendar. That brings us to number 33. The image of all 56 signers gathered in one grand room, one dramatic afternoon, each stepping forward to sign in turn. It's a wonderful painting. It just isn't what happened. The signatures were added over a stretch of months, not minutes. Most of the delegates signed on August 2, but not all of them were even present that day. Some were away, off tending to the war or their states, and signed whenever they next made it back to Philadelphia. A few added their names considerably later in the year. One signer, Thomas McKean of Delaware, may not have signed until 1777, so late that historians still argue about the exact date. There was no single choreographed moment, no room full of men signing as one. There was a document that sat available, and men who came and put their names to it as they were able, one at a time, across a long and scattered autumn. Number 34 is the one with the bell, the Liberty Bell, rung out over Philadelphia to announce independence to a cheering crowd. It's a lovely scene, and it almost certainly never rang for that reason. There's no contemporary record of the bell tolling for the Declaration at all. And there's a practical problem underneath the romance. The bell steeple was in poor condition by then, the tower reportedly too rickety to take much hard ringing. The whole story, the old bellman, the waiting boy, the joyful peal, comes from a piece of fiction. A writer named George Lippard published it in the 1840s, more than 60 years after the fact, as a sentimental tale. And it was so charming that people quietly absorbed it as history. The bell became a beloved symbol of liberty later, which is fair enough. But it did not ring the country into being. That part was invented by a storyteller, long after everyone involved was gone. Number 35 asks us to slow the celebration down a little. The belief that the Declaration, once adopted, instantly made America an independent country. It didn't, and it couldn't. The Declaration was exactly what its name says. A declaration, a statement of intent. It announced to Britain and the world what the colonies meant to become. It did not by itself make it so. Declaring your independence and possessing it are very different things, and Britain was not in the habit of taking a colony's word for it. What followed the paper was 7 more years of grinding, uncertain war. Independence wasn't secured on the page in 1776. It was fought for, at Saratoga and Valley Forge in Yorktown, and only truly settled in 1783, when the Treaty of Paris finally recognized the United States as free. So the 4th of July marks a promise made, not a fact accomplished. The nation the document describes still had to survive long enough to exist. Number 36. The picture of a united people, nearly every colonist rising as one behind the cause of independence. The reality was far more divided. Historians estimate that only about a third of the colonists actively supported the revolution. Another third or so were loyalists, people who considered themselves British, wanted to stay British, and regarded the whole rebellion as reckless or treasonous or simply doomed. And the remaining third, roughly, tried to stay out of it altogether, keeping their heads down and hoping the whole thing would pass. This was not a country marching in step. It was a divided, anxious population, with neighbors on opposite sides and families split down the middle. Thousands of loyalists would eventually flee the country entirely, to Canada and back to Britain, when the war went against them. The founding wasn't a unanimous swell of patriotism. It was a hard-fought argument, and a great many Americans of the day were on the other side of it, or trying very hard not to be on any side at all. That carries us to number 37, and this one surprises people. The idea that the Declaration of Independence is America's supreme law, the founding legal document the country runs on. It isn't law at all. The Declaration has no legal force whatsoever. It doesn't govern anything. It establishes no courts, grants no powers, defines no rights that a judge can enforce. It's a statement of principle and a public breakup letter to a king, and it is magnificent as those things. But the document that actually governs the United States, that creates the branches of government, sets the rules and carries the force of law, is the Constitution, written 11 years later, in 1787. People sometimes reach for the Declaration in legal arguments, quoting all men are created equal, as if it were binding statute. It's stirring. It just isn't law. The Declaration is the country's mission statement. The Constitution is its rule book, and it's the rule book, not the mission statement, that the whole machinery of government actually answers to. Number 38 is about the most quoted line in the whole thing. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, Jefferson's wholly original, out-of-nowhere phrase. It wasn't quite out of nowhere. Jefferson was writing in a long tradition, and he was reworking a formula that his educated readers would have recognized immediately. The English philosopher John Locke, nearly a century earlier, had written of the natural rights to life, liberty, and property. That trio was practically common currency among Enlightenment thinkers. What Jefferson did, and it was a genuine stroke, was swap out that last word. Not property, but the pursuit of happiness. It's a subtle change with enormous reach, opening the idea of rights beyond mere ownership into something broader and stranger, and more human. So the line is Jefferson's in the way a great melody is the composer's. He arranged it, he perfected it, he made it sing. But the underlying notes were Locke's, and everyone in that room would have heard the echo. Number 39 is the one that makes the rounds every summer, usually in a heartfelt post. The claim that every signer was hunted down, ruined, and made to suffer terribly for daring to sign. There's a viral piece that circulates each 4th of July, listing the awful fates supposedly suffered by all 56 signers, captured, tortured, bankrupted, their families destroyed to a man. It's stirring. It's also heavily exaggerated. Some signers did pay real prices. A few had property seized or destroyed, and some suffered genuine hardship during the war. That much is true and worth honoring. But the sweeping version that all of them, or nearly all, were personally hunted and broken collapses under a look at the records. Most signers lived on. Many kept their fortunes, held high office afterward, and died comfortably in old age. The signing was a real risk, a genuine act of treason in British eyes. But the founders were not, as a group, martyred for it. The tidy tragic list is patriotism doing what it often does, rounding a complicated truth up into a cleaner, sadder legend. And that brings us, gently, to number 40, which ties the whole day together. The image of the Declaration written and signed in a single sitting one afternoon in Independence Hall. By now you can probably feel why it's wrong. Nothing about the Declaration happened in one sitting. Jefferson drafted it privately over about 2 weeks in June of 1776, alone in a rented room, revising as he went. Then came Benjamin Franklin and John Adams, offering edits. Then the full Congress got hold of it and spent days cutting it down, trimming roughly a quarter of Jefferson's words while he sat there, quietly wincing. Adoption came on July 4. The formal signing began on August 2 and trailed on for months after. Drafting, editing, adopting, signing, 4 separate acts, spread across weeks, involving many hands. The single dramatic scene we imagine, one room and one glorious afternoon, is a compression of something much slower and messier and more argued over, which is, when you think about it, a rather fitting way for a democracy to be born. The Declaration announced what they wanted to be free from. The Constitution, drafted 11 years later in that same Philadelphia summer heat, was the harder document, the one that had to answer the question of what they wanted to build instead. And a surprising amount of what people believe about that answer isn't quite right. Myth number 41. The founders set out to create a democracy. It's the word we reach for automatically. The founders gave us democracy. But that's not the word they would have chosen, and in many cases it's the very thing they were trying to avoid. To a well-read man of the 1780s, democracy meant direct, unfiltered rule by the crowd, and the crowd frightened them. They had read their classical history, and they believed pure democracies tended to burn hot and collapse. James Madison in Federalist No. 10 drew a careful line between a democracy and a republic, and argued firmly for the republic, a system where the people don't rule directly but elect representatives to govern on their behalf, with layers of buffering in between. That's why the president is chosen by electors, why senators were originally picked by state legislatures rather than voters, why the whole machine is full of filters. They built a republic on purpose, precisely because they distrusted the passions of a raw majority. The word democracy appears nowhere in the Constitution at all. Myth number 42, America was founded as a Christian nation. This one comes up often, and it deserves a calm, factual answer rather than an argument. Whatever the private faith of individual founders, and it ranged widely, the government they built made a rather explicit statement on the matter. In 1797, the United States signed a treaty with Tripoli, negotiated under Washington and signed by President John Adams, to protect American ships in the Mediterranean. Article 11 of that treaty states, in plain language, that the government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. The Senate read the treaty aloud and ratified it unanimously, without recorded objection. It was printed in the newspapers. Now, this was a diplomatic document meant to reassure a Muslim power that the young republic held no religious grievance against it. But the phrasing was theirs, endorsed by the government itself. Whatever else you make of it, that's what the official record says. Myth number 43, which follows naturally. The Constitution names God or invokes Jesus somewhere in its text. It doesn't. You can read the whole thing, the preamble, all 7 articles, and you will not find the word God or Jesus or Christianity or Creator. This is genuinely striking when you consider the age, when nearly every founding document a person might encounter opened with an appeal to the Almighty. The Declaration of Independence, remember, mentions a creator and nature's God. The Constitution, written 11 years later, mentions neither. The single nod to religion is a matter of pure convention. The document is dated in the year of our Lord, 1787. The standard way anyone wrote a date then, no more a theological statement than writing AD on a letter. The one place religion is named directly is Article 6, which forbids any religious test for holding office. That's the closest the Constitution comes to the subject, an instruction that faith shall not be a qualification for power. Myth number 44. Separation of church and state is a phrase written into the Constitution. People quote it as though they could point to the article and line, and it isn't there. The Constitution's actual language, in the First Amendment, is that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Careful, lawyerly wording, but not that famous phrase. The phrase separation of church and state comes from a letter. In 1802, President Thomas Jefferson wrote to a group of Baptists in Danbury, Connecticut, who had worried about their religious freedom, and reassured them that the First Amendment had built a wall of separation between church and state. It was a private letter, a vivid metaphor from one man's pen. It later became enormously influential in how courts read the Constitution, but it is Jefferson's image, written 13 years after the document itself, not a clause the founders voted into law. That brings us to number 45, and it jumps ahead of the founding entirely. The idea that the founders wrote the Pledge of Allegiance. They did not, and they couldn't have. It didn't exist in their lifetimes or for a full century after. The pledge was written in 1892 by Francis Bellamy, a Baptist minister and a socialist, to be recited by school children for the 400th anniversary of Columbus's voyage. It was in part a promotional idea tied to a magazine, and the selling of flags to schools. And the words we know weren't even fixed then. The phrase "under God," the part people most associate with the founding, wasn't in Bellamy's original at all. It was added in 1954, during the Cold War, by an act of Congress. So a pledge many imagine echoing down from Washington and Jefferson is, in its familiar form, younger than the automobile. Myth number 46. The founders meant for everyone to vote. Here the truth is simply narrower than the ideal. When they wrote of government by the people who could actually cast a ballot were a distinctly limited group. In most states at the founding, voting was reserved for white men who owned a certain amount of property, the reasoning being that a man with land had a real stake in the community's stability. Women could not vote, enslaved people, of course, could not. Free black men were barred in most places, and men without property were often shut out too. Estimates vary, but only a modest fraction of the adult population could legally vote in the earliest elections. The gradual widening of that circle, dropping the property requirement, and then over the next century and a half, extending the vote across lines of race and sex, was the work of generations who came after. The founders opened a door. They did not open it for everyone. Number 47. The Electoral College was designed purely to protect the small states from the large ones. That's the tidy explanation. And it isn't the whole story. Small state protection was one factor, and a real one, but the origins of the Electoral College are genuinely tangled, and one thread runs straight through slavery. The convention argued for a long time over how to choose a president. A direct popular vote was proposed and rejected, and one reason it was rejected is that the southern states knew a straight count of voters would leave them outnumbered because so much of their population was enslaved and could not vote. The 3/5 compromise, which counted enslaved people toward a state's representation without granting them any voice, was already baked into how House seats were apportioned. Because electoral votes were tied to that same apportionment, the arrangement carried the extra weight of the enslaved population into the choosing of the president too. The college was a bundle of compromises over size, over trust in the public, over region, and slavery was quietly woven through it. Myth number 48. The founders were united against political parties, and none formed on their watch. They certainly said they disliked parties. Washington, in his farewell address, warned gravely against the spirit of party. The trouble is that the very men issuing those warnings were, at the same moment, busy founding the first parties themselves. By the 1790s, Washington's own cabinet had split into two camps. Alexander Hamilton led the Federalists, who wanted a strong central government and a national bank. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison led the opposition, the Democratic Republicans, who feared exactly that concentration of power. They founded newspapers to attack each other, organized voters, and fought bitterly. The election of 1800 between Jefferson and Adams was as vicious as anything in American politics since. So the notion of a serene party-free founding is a myth the founding generation disproved almost immediately. They distrusted factions and then promptly built them. Number 49, and it's one people are often surprised by. The Bill of Rights was part of the original Constitution. It wasn't. When the Constitution was signed in September of 1787 and sent to the states, it contained no Bill of Rights, no First Amendment, no freedom of speech or religion spelled out, none of it. And that absence nearly sank the whole project. Several states were deeply uneasy about ratifying a document that granted the new government real power without explicitly guaranteeing the people's liberties. Anti-Federalists made it their central objection. To win ratification, supporters struck a bargain. Approve the Constitution now, and a set of protective amendments will follow. James Madison, who had initially thought a Bill of Rights unnecessary, took up the task and shepherded them through the new Congress. The first 10 amendments were ratified in 1791, 4 years after the Constitution itself. The Bill of Rights, in other words, was a promise made to close a deal, and kept. Which brings us, gently, to number 50. The belief that the founders spoke with one clear, settled voice on the Second Amendment. They did not, and it's worth stating this plainly and without heat. The amendment's own wording carries its context inside it. A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, shall not be infringed. That opening clause about the militia mattered enormously to men who had just fought a war and who deeply feared a large standing army under central control. Their answer to that fear was an armed citizenry organized into state militias. But even at the time, the meaning was discussed, drafted, and redrafted. The phrasing went through several versions in Congress before it settled. The idea that the founding generation handed down a single, crystal clear intention on this question flattens what was, from the very beginning, a matter they weighed and worded with care. Like much of what they built, it was an argument before it was an answer. The government they built was elegant on paper, but it was built over something the men who signed it mostly did not name aloud. And if we're being honest about them, we have to sit for a while with the hardest part of the story. Myth number 51. The comforting idea that the founders were all secret abolitionists at heart, that whatever they did in public, they privately longed to end slavery. Some did wrestle with it, but many of them enslaved human beings for the whole of their lives, without ever letting go. Washington held people in bondage at Mount Vernon until his death. Jefferson enslaved hundreds and freed only a handful. Madison, the man who drafted so much of the Constitution, enslaved people his entire life and never freed them, even in his will. These weren't reluctant men trapped by circumstance and quietly aching for reform. Slavery was woven into how they lived, how they farmed, how they paid their debts and furnished their homes. A few spoke against it in the abstract while depending on it in practice. The gentle version, where they all secretly agreed with us, is a story we tell to make them easier to admire. The records don't support it. That brings us to number 52. The belief that the Constitution abolished slavery, or at least condemned it. It did neither. The word slavery doesn't appear in the original document. The men who wrote it were careful about that, but the thing itself is protected in 3 separate places. The Constitution barred Congress from ending the importation of enslaved people until 1808, guaranteeing the Atlantic slave trade a full 20 more years. It included a fugitive slave clause, requiring that people who escaped bondage be returned. And it counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for the purpose of representation, handing slaveholding states extra seats in Congress for a population they refused to free. The framers wrapped these provisions in euphemism, other persons, such persons, but they knew exactly what they were shielding. The founding document didn't strike a blow against slavery. It gave it constitutional cover. Number 53 asks us to look closely at something people would rather keep soft. The picture of Washington and Jefferson as kind, paternal enslavers, stern but caring men, running something almost like a large family. The plantation records tell a harder story. At Mount Vernon and Monticello, enslaved people did grueling labor from childhood into old age on strict quotas, under overseers. Jefferson's own farm records note the productivity of children as young as 10 in his nail factory. When people fled, both men pursued them. Washington, while president, quietly worked to recover a young enslaved woman named Ona Judge after she escaped to New Hampshire. She evaded him for the rest of her life. Families were divided by sale and inheritance. Mothers parted from children, husbands from wives, whenever an estate needed settling or a debt needed paying. There was affection in places, and there was cruelty in places. But the fundamental relationship was ownership. Calling it gentle is a kindness the historical record doesn't earn. From the plantations of the South we turn to a wider map, and number 54. The assumption that slavery, at the founding, was purely a Southern institution. It wasn't. At the start of the Revolution, slavery was legal in all 13 colonies, every one of them, North and South. There were enslaved people in New York, in Boston, in Philadelphia, in Rhode Island, which was deeply entangled in the slave trade itself. Northern merchants built fortunes shipping enslaved Africans and the goods their labor produced. The North would begin dismantling slavery first. Vermont's 1777 Constitution moved against it, and states like Pennsylvania and Massachusetts followed in the years after. But those were gradual halting processes, and they came after independence, not before. At the moment the founders declared that all men are created equal, a person could be legally bought and sold in every colony that signed on. Slavery wasn't a regional exception to the founding, it was national, which leads naturally to number 55. The idea that only Southern founders enslaved people, while the Northern ones kept their hands clean. Some Northern figures enslaved people too, And the most striking example is a man we tend to file under wisdom and wit, Benjamin Franklin. Franklin enslaved several people over the course of his life, and for years his own newspaper ran advertisements for the sale of enslaved men and women. He was not born an abolitionist. He became one, slowly, late in life, and when he turned fully. By the 1780s, Franklin was serving as president of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, and in 1790, in one of his final public acts, he signed a petition to the First Congress calling for an end to slavery. It was rejected. Franklin's story isn't one of lifelong virtue. It's one of a man who profited from the institution and then at the end worked against it. Both halves are true. Number 56. The reassuring notion that the founders knew slavery was already dying and simply let it fade on its own. Some of them genuinely believed that. In the 1780s, with tobacco exhausting the soil and the trade in some disorder, a number of founders convinced themselves that slavery was economically doomed and would wither within a generation. Then, in 1793, came a small machine that changed everything. Eli Whitney's cotton gin made it possible to clean short staple cotton quickly, and short staple cotton could grow across a vast stretch of the South. Almost overnight, enslaved labor became more profitable than anyone had imagined, not less. Cotton exploded into the country's great cash crop, and slavery didn't fade. It spread west, deepened, and dug in, decade after decade, until it took a war to end it. The founders who bet on a quiet death were catastrophically wrong. And the invention that betrayed their hope arrived while most of them were still alive to see it. Number 57 is one that gets repeated with real anger, and it's worth slowing down to get right. The claim that the 3/5 clause meant the founders considered black people to be 3/5 of a human being. That isn't what the clause was about. It was a formula for counting population to apportion seats in Congress. And here the alignment is the opposite of what people assume. Slaveholding states wanted enslaved people counted as whole persons, not out of respect, but because more counted heads meant more representatives and more power for the slaveholders themselves. The anti-slavery delegates from the North wanted them counted as little as possible, ideally not at all, precisely to deny the South that extra political weight. 3/5 was the ugly compromise between those two positions. It was never a statement about the worth of a human soul. It was a calculation about power, which in a way is its own kind of grim, a person's very existence reduced to a fraction on a ledger of votes. But the myth, however righteous it sounds, gets the mechanics backward. Number 58 corrects an absence rather than a claim. The quiet assumption that no black or non-white people helped shape the founding at all. They did, and their names deserve to be said plainly. Crispus Attucks, a man of African and native descent, was among the first to die in the Boston Massacre of 1770, one of the first to fall for the cause. James Armistead, an enslaved man, served as a spy under the Marquis de Lafayette, feeding the Americans intelligence that helped trap the British at Yorktown. He was later freed and took the name James Armistead Lafayette in honor of the general who vouched for him. Phillis Wheatley, kidnapped from West Africa as a child, became a celebrated poet whose verse Washington himself praised in a letter. Benjamin Banneker, a free black astronomer and almanac maker, helped survey the land that became the nation's capital and wrote directly to Jefferson challenging him on slavery. The founding wasn't the work of white men alone. It never was. Number 59. The idea that abolitionism simply didn't exist yet, that ending slavery was unthinkable in the founders' world, so we shouldn't judge them by it. But it was thinkable, and people were thinking it right there alongside them. The Quakers had been organizing against slavery for decades. The Pennsylvania Abolition Society was founded in 1775, the very year fighting began, and reorganized in the 1780s. Anti-slavery voices were active in pulpits and pamphlets and petitions throughout the founding era. This matters because it means the founders who kept enslaving people weren't merely men of their time with no alternative in view. The alternative was being argued in their own cities, in their own language, by their own contemporaries. Some founders eventually joined, Franklin and Alexander Hamilton among them, though both came to it comparatively late. The point isn't that everyone should have known better in hindsight. It's that some people already did know better at the time and said so. And that brings us gently to number 60, the last of the hard ones. The belief that Jefferson's original draft of the Declaration would have abolished slavery if only it hadn't been cut. It's true that Jefferson included a passage on slavery, and true that Congress struck it out, but read what it actually said. Jefferson's deleted paragraph didn't call for freeing the enslaved. It blamed King George for the slave trade, accusing the British Crown of forcing the execrable commerce upon the innocent colonies, as though Americans were slavery's victims rather than its practitioners. It was a passage that condemned the trade while dodging the fact that Jefferson himself, and the men around him, held hundreds of people in bondage and had no intention of letting them go. Congress cut it, partly at the insistence of South Carolina and Georgia. So the lost passage isn't a tragic road not taken toward emancipation. It's a piece of blame-shifting written by an enslaver that would have freed no one at all. And that, more than any single myth, is the shape of the whole subject. Not a clean fight between heroes and villains, but a nation of contradictions, built by people who knew better and chose otherwise. Every one of the men who signed and argued and drafted eventually had to reckon with the fact that words on parchment don't win a war. Muskets do, and mud, and 8 long years. So let's leave the founding documents behind for a while and walk out onto the battlefield, where the myths grow just as thick. Myth number 61 is the one the whole national story is built on. Plucky American underdogs, armed with little more than grit and good aim, defeating the mightiest empire on earth all by themselves. They did not do it by themselves, not even close. The truth is that the American Revolution was won with French money, French muskets, French gunpowder, French soldiers, and, at the decisive moment, the French Navy. France poured an enormous sum into the war effort, loans and outright gifts that the young United States could never have raised on its own. Much of the powder the Continentals fired in the early years came through French channels. By 1780, French troops under the Comte de Rochambeau were marching alongside Washington's men. It was a genuine partnership and a lopsided one. Without France, there is no independent America. The underdog had a very powerful friend, which brings us naturally to number 62, and the battle that supposedly sealed it all. Yorktown, 1781, remembered as the Great American Triumph, Washington's crowning victory. Yorktown was a French victory, at least as much as an American one. Here's the thing about how Cornwallis got trapped on that Virginia peninsula. The reason he couldn't escape by sea, the reason no British rescue fleet could reach him, was a French one. Admiral de Grasse brought his fleet up from the Caribbean and defeated the British Navy at the Battle of the Chesapeake, slamming the door shut on the water. On land, roughly half the troops besieging Yorktown were French regulars. French engineers directed much of the siege work. Washington commanded, and commanded well. But the guns that hammered Cornwallis into surrender, and the ships that made surrender the only option, flew the flag of France. It was less a lone American conquest than a coalition closing a trap. That takes us to number 63, and a smaller homespun version of the same myth. The idea that ragtag minutemen, farmers grabbing muskets off the wall, won the revolution. The minutemen were real, and they mattered early, but they didn't win the war. Wars aren't won by men who go home to bring in the harvest. What won it was the Continental Army, a trained, professional, disciplined force that Washington and others spent years building, drilling, and holding together through desertion, starvation, and defeat after defeat. The turning point in that transformation came at Valley Forge, where a Prussian officer, Baron von Steuben, taught the ragged army to march, maneuver, and hold a line like proper soldiers. That army, plus the French alliance, fought on for 8 grinding years. The militia harassed and skirmished and filled gaps. The Continentals, professionals, in the end, did the winning. The pitchfork farmer is a lovely image. He was not the whole story. Number 64 moves from the battlefield to the reason anyone was fighting at all. You've been told the revolution erupted because Britain was crushing the colonists under brutal, backbreaking taxes. The colonists were, in fact, among the most lightly taxed people in the entire British Empire. Historians who've run the numbers find that the average colonist paid a small fraction of what a subject back in Britain paid. Some estimates put it at a fraction as low as 1 to 20. The money was never really the grievance. The grievance was the principle. Parliament was taxing the colonies while the colonies had not a single elected representative sitting in it. No taxation without representation was not a complaint about the size of the bill. It was a complaint about who got to write it. That's a subtler thing to go to war over than an empty wallet. But that's what they went to war over, not the amount, but the arrangement, which is the perfect setup for number 65, because this is the one almost everyone gets exactly backwards. The Boston Tea Party, we're told, was a furious protest against a tax hike that made tea too expensive. The Tea Act of 1773 actually made tea cheaper. That's the part that never survives the retelling. The law was designed to rescue the struggling East India Company by letting it sell tea directly to the colonies, undercutting even the smugglers. British tea was about to become a bargain. So why hurl it into the harbor? Because cheap tea came with a hook. Buying it meant accepting the company's monopoly and quietly accepting the tax on tea that Parliament had never given up the right to impose. To pay the lower price was to concede the principle. So on the night of December 16, 1733, men thinly disguised as Mohawk warriors dumped 342 chests into Boston Harbor, refusing a discount because of the string attached to it. They weren't angry it cost too much, they were angry it was a trap. Number 66, this is the big one, the ride every schoolchild can recite. Paul Revere galloping alone through the night, shouting, "The British are coming. The British are coming," all the way to Concord. Nearly every piece of that is wrong. Start with the shout. Revere would never have yelled, "The British are coming," because in 1775 the colonists still thought of themselves as British. The countryside was full of British subjects. What he actually spread, quietly and door to door, was the warning that the regulars are coming out, the regulars being the British Army troops. And he wasn't alone. He was one of several riders that night. William Dawes rode a different route, and a physician named Samuel Prescott joined them along the way. Here's the ending Longfellow's poem left out. Revere never made it to Concord. He was stopped and detained by a British patrol outside Lexington. Of the riders, it was Prescott who actually got through to Concord. The Lone Midnight Hero is a poem, written 85 years later. The real night was a whispered relay of many riders, and its most famous one got caught, staying out on that same road, number 67. The Battle of Lexington, imagined as a planned orderly clash, two lines squaring off, the noble opening battle of the Revolution. It was nothing so tidy. What happened on Lexington Green at dawn on April 19, 1775, was closer to chaos than to a battle. A small band of colonial militia, badly outnumbered, stood on the common as the British column arrived. Someone shouted for the militia to disperse, and they were beginning to. Then a shot rang out, and to this day, no one knows who fired it. Not the British officers, not the colonists, not any historian since. It may have come from a bystander, a stone wall, a nervous finger on either side. That single unknown shot is the one Emerson later immortalized as the shot heard round the world. It wasn't the crack of a planned battle. It was an accident in the half-light, and 8 colonists lay dead before anyone fully understood what had begun. Number 68 steps off the battlefield and into the sewing room. Betsy Ross, the humble Philadelphia seamstress, stitching the very first American flag at George Washington's personal request. There is no contemporary evidence for any of it. No letter, no diary, no record from the 1770s connecting Betsy Ross to the design or sewing of the first flag. Betsy Ross was a real person and a real upholsterer who did sew flags in Philadelphia. But the famous story Washington visiting her little shop, the folded paper, the 5-pointed star she supposedly showed him how to cut in a single snip, didn't appear until 1870. That's nearly a century later, and it came from her grandson, William Canby, who told it to a historical society based on family recollection. It's a charming tale, and it may hold a thread of truth. But as documented history, the first flag has no confirmed seamstress. The legend was quilted together from a grandson's memories, long after everyone who could confirm it was gone. Number 69 gently undoes something we picture without realizing it. The founders as young revolutionaries, hot-blooded rebels in their 20s, overturning the old order. Some were young. Hamilton and Madison were in their 20s and 30s. But most of the men we call the founders were nothing like a student uprising. They were established, middle-aged figures with a great deal to lose: landowners, lawyers, merchants, planters, men with reputations and estates and comfortable positions inside the very system they were risking everything to break. Washington was in his 40s. Franklin, the elder of them all, was around 70. These were not impulsive youths storming the gates. They were, for the most part, careful men of property who arrived at revolution slowly and knew exactly what a losing rebellion would cost them, their fortunes, and quite possibly their necks. That, if anything, makes the gamble stranger. It's easy to be reckless at 20. It's harder at 50, with everything already in hand. And that brings us, at last, to number 70. Molly Pitcher, the brave woman who carried water to the troops and then took her fallen husband's place at the cannon during the Battle of Monmouth. Molly Pitcher, as a single flesh and blood person, most likely never existed. The name doesn't appear in any record from the battle itself. It surfaced only in the 1800s. What historians believe is that Molly Pitcher is a composite, a folk figure stitched together from the real deeds of several women who followed the army and helped in battle. Women did carry water to swab and cool the cannon. At least one, Mary Ludwig Hayes, is said to have worked a gun at Monmouth in 1778, and another, Margaret Corbin, genuinely took over her husband's cannon at Fort Washington and was badly wounded doing it. So the courage was real and plural. Molly Pitcher is the name we gave to many women at once, so we'd have one to remember, which is its own quiet kind of forgetting. From the battlefields and the myths of the war, let's step in a little closer, past the marble, past the monuments, to the men themselves, in their private lives, with their tempers and their friendships and their flaws. Myth number 71, the idea that the founders were a uniform set of saintly figures, wise, serene, all rowing in the same direction. They were nothing of the kind. They were a room full of brilliant, prickly, ambitious human beings who spent an astonishing amount of time at each other's throats. They feuded in letters and in newspapers, often under fake names, tearing into one another's characters. They nursed grudges that lasted decades. Some of them had affairs or were accused of them, and at least one confessed to it in print. And on at least one famous occasion, two of them settled their differences with loaded pistols at 10 paces. The serene, unanimous band of brothers is a portrait painted long after the fact. The real founding generation was messy, competitive, and deeply, recognizably human. That's not a flaw in the story. That's the interesting part. Number 72 takes us to the most famous outsider of the bunch. The assumption that Alexander Hamilton was American-born, as native to the colonies as any of them. He wasn't. Hamilton was born on the island of Nevis, in the British West Indies, and raised largely on nearby St. Croix. He was, in the plainest sense, an immigrant. He came to New York as a teenager, an orphan of uncertain birth, his passage paid by local men who'd noticed how sharp he was. He had no family name, no fortune, no land, none of the inherited advantages that so many of the others took for granted. Everything he became, he built after stepping off a boat. It's worth sitting with that for a moment. One of the principal architects of the American financial system, the man on the $10 bill, was a penniless kid from a Caribbean island who talked and rode his way into the center of a country he wasn't born in. Which brings us, gently, to number 73, the belief that Hamilton, given all that brilliance and influence, must at some point have been president. He never was. It's an easy mistake. He looms so large and his face is on the money, and money tends to feel presidential. But Hamilton never held the office, and never could have won it, in part because of that West Indies birth and the enemies he made along the way. The highest post he ever held was Secretary of the Treasury, the very first one, appointed by Washington in 1789. From that chair he did something quietly enormous. He designed the young nation's financial machinery, the debt system, the national bank, the customs revenue, the plumbing that let the United States function as a real country rather than a hopeful idea. Enormous power, no presidency. He shaped the office of the money without ever occupying the office of the man. Number 74 is the one people get wrong even when they think they know it. How Hamilton died. The vague sense most people carry is that he fell in battle, or was carried off by some period illness. He wasn't. Hamilton was shot to death in a duel. On the morning of July 11, 1804, He rowed across the Hudson to a ledge near Weehawken, New Jersey, and faced Aaron Burr, who was, at that very moment, the sitting Vice President of the United States. The two had feuded for years, and a final round of insults pushed it past the point of return. Burr's shot struck Hamilton in the abdomen. He was carried back across the river and died the next day. Sit with that a second. A former Treasury Secretary, killed by the acting Vice President in an illegal duel while in office. It sounds invented. It's simply what happened. That naturally raises the question of number 75. The other man on that ledge, Aaron Burr, remembered as a pure cartoon villain, all sneer and no substance. The real Burr is harder to dismiss. He was a genuine Revolutionary War officer who served with distinction, a capable lawyer, a United States senator, and, again, the Vice President of the United States under Thomas Jefferson. He was charming, learned, and for a time one of the most powerful men in the country. Yes, he killed Hamilton, and it ended him politically. And a few years later he was arrested and tried for treason, accused of a bizarre scheme to carve out an empire in the West. And he was acquitted, the evidence too thin to convict. He was ambitious, slippery, and disastrous, but the flat little villain of the storybooks flattens a far stranger and more complicated man. Number 76 is about a friendship, one of the great ones, and it did not run smooth. The picture of John Adams and Thomas Jefferson as lifelong, easy companions. For a stretch they were close, then politics tore them apart. When they ended up on opposite sides of the fierce party battles of the 1790s, Adams a Federalist, Jefferson leading the opposition, the friendship curdled into something bitter. The election of 1800, which Jefferson won against the sitting President Adams, left them barely speaking. For 11 years, two of the most important men in American history simply went silent on each other. Then, in 1812, nudged by a mutual friend, Adams wrote a short note. Jefferson wrote back, and they spent the next 14 years exchanging some of the most remarkable letters in the language, arguing, reminiscing, forgiving. Then, famously, they died on the very same day. But the warmth at the end was hard-won, and it came only after a long, cold silence. Number 77 asks for a bit of care, because it corrects a sweeping claim in the other direction. The idea that every major founder enslaved people, that all of them, without exception, were slaveholders. Most of the famous ones were, and this series has not softened that. But there was a notable exception, and it was John Adams. Adams never enslaved a single human being, and he said plainly that this was a matter of principle, that slavery was, in his word, a form of evil he wanted no part of. He hired free labor to work his Massachusetts farm instead, sometimes at real cost to himself. He was no flawless racial visionary by our standards, and he could be cautious about pushing abolition too fast for fear of splitting the fragile Union. But on the simple personal question, did he own people, the answer, alone among the biggest names, is no. It's a distinction worth keeping. Number 78 clears away a bit of social snobbery. The picture of the founders as a uniform class of powdered aristocratic lawyers. Plenty were lawyers, it's true, and some were genuinely wealthy. But the group was far more mixed than the marble suggests. Benjamin Franklin began as a printer, ink under his fingernails, a working tradesman who never fully lost the identity. Others were farmers in the literal hands-in-the-dirt sense. There were merchants, a physician or two, a Rhode Island craftsman, men who'd made their way in trade rather than inheriting it. They were, on the whole, an accomplished and comparatively privileged bunch. No one's calling them ordinary. But the image of a closed circle of identical gentlemen lawyers misses how many of them came up through a shop, a farm, or a ledger. It was a broader, scrappier crowd than the portraits led on. Number 79 is a quote, one of the most thrilling lines in American memory. Patrick Henry, thundering to the Virginia Convention in 1775, "Give me liberty or give me death." He may well have said something very like it. The trouble is that nobody wrote the speech down at the time. There is no transcript, no manuscript in Henry's hand, no contemporary text of those words. What we have came decades later, in an 1817 biography by a man named William Wirt, who reconstructed the speech largely from the aging memories of people who claimed to have been in the room, most notably a single elderly judge recalling an event from more than 40 years earlier. The famous, ringing wording is very likely Wirt's polish laid over Henry's fire. The passion was real. The exact immortal sentence is, in all honesty, a memory of a memory, set down long after the man had died. And that carries us, fittingly, to number 80, another last line, spoken at the very edge of death. Nathan Hale, the young schoolteacher turned spy, hanged by the British in 1776, said to have declared, "I only regret that I have but one life to lose for my country." It's a beautiful line, and Hale was real, a continental officer, barely 21, caught behind British lines and executed without much ceremony. But whether he actually said those exact words, no one can prove. No official British record of the hanging preserves them. The polished sentence we all know surfaced later, in second-hand accounts, and it bears a suspicious resemblance to a fashionable line from a popular play of the era, Joseph Addison's Cato, which the revolutionary generation adored and quoted constantly. Hale may have said something brave in his final moments, but the perfect, quotable version was very likely tidied up, or supplied outright, by admirers who came after, arranging a young man's death into the shape a nation wanted to remember. From the men themselves, it's worth drifting outward for a while, to the coins in your pocket, the symbols on the seal, the holidays and institutions we quietly credit to their hands, because a great deal of what feels ancient and founding era turns out to be younger than you'd guess. Myth number 81. That in God we trust and the country's religious mottos came down to us from the founders themselves. It's a natural assumption. The words are stamped on every coin, printed on every bill. They feel as old as the Republic, but the founders never put them there. In God We Trust doesn't appear on American money until the 1860s during the Civil War, when a wave of religious feeling and letters from clergymen worried about a godless coinage pushed the Treasury to add it. It first appeared on a 2-cent piece in 1864, and it didn't become the official national motto of the United States until 1956, when Congress made it so, largely as a Cold War gesture against officially atheist communism. That's nearly 2 centuries after independence. The men in the powdered portraits had been dead for generations. Whatever you think of the phrase, it isn't theirs. It belongs to a much later, more anxious America. Number 82. The comfortable belief that the founders were wealthy men who stayed wealthy, that they signed and won and retired into gentle prosperity. Many of them died broke. We've touched on Jefferson, buried under crushing debt with Monticello sold off to cover it, but he had plenty of company. The most striking case is Robert Morris, the financier of the Revolution, the man whose personal credit helped keep Washington's army fed and paid when the government couldn't. Morris was, for a time, perhaps the richest man in America. He signed the Declaration, the Articles, and the Constitution, one of only a handful to sign all 3. And he ended up in debtor's prison in Philadelphia, ruined by wild land speculation, serving more than 3 years behind bars while old colleagues visited him in his cell. The revolution made fortunes for almost no one who financed it. Turns out founding a country is an expensive hobby, and the bill often came due personally. That brings us, appropriately, to number 83, the money itself. The idea that the founders sat down and designed the dollar, symbol and all. They didn't invent it so much as inherit it. The word dollar and the coin behind it come from the Spanish dollar, the silver piece of 8 that circulated all through the colonies because British coin was chronically scarce. When Americans reached for a familiar unit of money, they reached for the Spanish one already in their hands. Even the dollar sign, that little S with a stroke through it, most likely evolved from the shorthand clerks used for the Spanish peso, the P and S gradually merging on the page over years of ledgers. The distinctly American paper currency, the greenback, the engraved portraits, the whole look of the money, came later, refined across the 19th and 20th centuries. The founders chose a name and a standard. The rest is accumulated habit. Number 84, Washington, D.C. The belief that the capital was always destined to sit there on the Potomac, chosen for its natural rightness. There was nothing destined about it. The location was a deal. In 1790, the young government was deadlocked on 2 ugly problems: where to put the permanent capital, and whether the federal government should assume the state's war debts. At a private dinner arranged by Jefferson, Hamilton and the Southern leaders struck a bargain. The South would let Hamilton's debt assumption plan pass. In exchange, the capital would move south to a patch of land on the Potomac near Washington's own Virginia. The Compromise of 1790, sometimes called the dinner table bargain, is why the capital sits where it does. Not fate, not geography, a trade over a good meal between men who didn't much like each other. The nation's most monumental city began as the sweetener in a debt negotiation. Number 85. That the founders wanted no army at all, that they were pure pacifists who dreamed of a nation without soldiers. This one has a real grain of truth and it's easy to overstate. The founders were genuinely deeply suspicious of large standing armies. They'd watched British regulars occupy their towns and they carried the old fear that a permanent professional army was a tool for tyranny. That distrust is written right into the Constitution, which lets Congress fund the army only 2 years at a time. But suspicion isn't abolition. These same men built a national military the moment the country needed one. They kept a small regular army, leaned on the state militias, and in 1794 Washington himself rode out at the head of thousands of troops to put down the Whiskey Rebellion. They didn't want a garrison state. They also had no intention of leaving the country defenseless. The truth sat, as it usually did with them, somewhere in the wary middle. Number 86. Uncle Sam, that lanky figure in the star-spangled top hat, pointing out from the recruiting poster. Surely a founding-era invention, born with the flag. He wasn't. Uncle Sam traces to a real man, and he arrives decades after the founding. His name was Samuel Wilson, a meatpacker in Troy, New York, during the War of 1812. Wilson supplied barrels of beef to the U.S. Army, each stamped U.S. for United States. Soldiers, the story goes, began joking that the initials stood for Uncle Sam Wilson, the friendly local provisioner feeding them. The nickname spread from the barrels to the government itself, and a personification was born. The tall white beard and the top hat came much later still, sharpened by cartoonists and finally fixed by that famous First World War poster. So the face of American government is, at bottom, a genial meat supplier from upstate New York, not a founder in sight. Number 87. The all-seeing eye on the back of the dollar, that floating eye above the unfinished pyramid. Proof, some insist, of a secret Masonic plot woven into the money by the founders. It's a wonderful story, and it doesn't hold. The eye and the pyramid belong to the Great Seal of the United States, and their symbolism is far more ordinary than the conspiracy needs it to be. The eye of Providence, an eye framed in rays of light, was a common artistic image in the 18th century, standing simply for the watchful eye of God over human affairs. It appeared in plenty of non-Masonic art of the era. The unfinished pyramid signified strength and a nation still being built, with 13 courses of stone for the 13 states. The designers who assembled the seal explained these meanings plainly at the time. And here's the quiet part everyone forgets. The eye and pyramid didn't even appear on the dollar bill until 1935, a 20th century design choice, not a founding era secret. Which leads us naturally to number 88. The claim that all the founders were Freemasons, that the whole revolution was a lodge meeting in disguise. Some were, some very much were not. Washington was a Freemason, initiated as a young man and prominent enough that he laid the U.S. Capitol cornerstone in a full Masonic ceremony in 1793. Benjamin Franklin was a Mason too, and an enthusiastic one, active in lodges on both sides of the Atlantic. So the fraternity's fingerprints are real, and you can see why the legend took hold. But it collapses the moment you count heads. Thomas Jefferson was not a Mason. John Adams was not a Mason and was later openly critical of the order. Neither was Patrick Henry. The founders were a scattered, argumentative bunch who couldn't agree on a bank, let alone all belong to one secret society. Some shared a handshake, most did not. The lodge did not run the revolution. Number 89. E pluribus unum, the belief that it was chosen as a pointed, anti-religious statement, a secular republic thumbing its nose at faith. It was nothing so combative. E pluribus unum is Latin for out of many, one, and its meaning is exactly as plain as it sounds. It was about union, 13 separate, jealous colonies becoming a single nation. That's the whole idea. Many states, one country. The phrase was adopted for the Great Seal in 1782, and the committee that chose it wasn't making a theological argument at all. They were reaching for a graceful classical motto to capture the act of joining together. There's a pleasant footnote too. The phrase may have been borrowed from an old poem about, of all things, a salad, in which many ingredients are blended into one. No coded message, no war on religion, just a tidy Latin line about many things becoming one thing. The founders liked their classics, and this was simply a good one. And that brings us gently to number 90, Thanksgiving, the warm assumption that the founders made it a national holiday, that it runs in an unbroken line from Pilgrims to Washington to your dinner table. The threads don't quite connect. There were early days of Thanksgiving, certainly. Washington issued a one-time proclamation for a day of thanks in 1789. But those were scattered, occasional observances called and forgotten as the moment required. There was no fixed national holiday, no recurring fourth Thursday tradition running down from the founding. The modern national Thanksgiving we actually keep came from Abraham Lincoln in 1863, in the middle of the Civil War, when he proclaimed a national day of Thanksgiving to be held each year, pushed there in no small part by a magazine editor named Sarah Josepha Hale, who'd campaigned for it for decades. The holiday you fall asleep after every November is a Civil War creation, an act of a wounded nation trying to find something to be grateful for, not the founder's gift at all. Lincoln's myth number 91 carries us out of the buildings and the institutions and into something smaller and stranger, the words, because the founders are quoted more often than almost anyone in American life, and a remarkable number of the things they supposedly said, they never said at all. Start with the one you've seen shared 1,000 times, usually in an argument. Benjamin Franklin, we're told, warned that those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. It's real, Franklin did write it in 1755, but it's almost always misquoted, and, more to the point, it's almost always misunderstood. Franklin wasn't musing about liberty and security in the grand abstract way we use the line today. He was writing on behalf of the Pennsylvania Assembly in the middle of a very specific squabble with the Penn family over taxes, over whether wealthy landowners could be taxed to fund frontier defense. The liberty in question was the Assembly's power to tax. It was a line about a colonial budget fight, not a timeless creed. That brings us to number 92, and to the most quoted piece of advice any president ever gave. Washington's farewell address, the one that warns the young country to steer clear of permanent alliances and foreign entanglements. For 2 centuries it's been held up as the pure, solitary wisdom of the retiring general, the father of the country speaking his heart before stepping away. And the sentiments were genuinely his, but the writing, much of it was not. Washington had help, a great deal of it from Alexander Hamilton, who took an earlier draft and largely rewrote it into the polished document history remembers. There had been an even earlier version drafted by James Madison years before. So the farewell address was less a lone man's testament than a careful collaboration, edited and reworked, with Hamilton's pen doing much of the shaping. Washington approved every word, and the ideas were his to approve. But the eloquence we quote so reverently was, in large part, borrowed from a younger man's hand, which is, if anything, a rather Washington way to do it. Number 93, that government is best which governs least. You've almost certainly seen it stamped under a portrait of Thomas Jefferson, treated as the crisp distillation of everything he believed about small government. Here's the thing, there's no evidence Jefferson ever wrote it or said it. It appears nowhere in his enormous surviving body of letters and papers, and scholars who've gone looking have come up empty every time. The line's actual pedigree runs elsewhere. It served as the motto of a 19th century magazine, the United States Magazine and Democratic Review, edited by John O'Sullivan, the same man who later coined Manifest Destiny. And it's most famous today from the opening of Henry David Thoreau's 1849 essay Civil Disobedience, where Thoreau quotes the motto approvingly before pushing it even further. Jefferson held plenty of views about limited government, but this particular slogan was put in his mouth decades after he was gone, by people who found it convenient to borrow his face. Number 94 keeps us in the business of quotes that wandered off and found a founder to attach themselves to. This one goes, "Democracy is two wolves and a lamb voting on what to have for lunch." It's pointed, it's memorable, and it is confidently, endlessly attributed to Benjamin Franklin. Franklin never said it. There's no trace of it in anything he wrote. No letter, no essay, no pamphlet, nothing. And the phrase itself doesn't appear anywhere until well into the 20th century, more than 150 years after Franklin's death. Its true origin is murky, the way these things tend to be. It seems to have surfaced in modern political writing and simply drifted, over time, onto the most quotable founder available. And Franklin, being witty and endlessly quotable, is a magnet for orphaned one-liners. If a clever aphorism needs a father and no one's sure who said it, Franklin usually gets the job. He didn't apply for it. Number 95 isn't a misquote so much as a wish we keep projecting backward. The comforting belief that the founders, if they could somehow see America now, would recognize it instantly and nod in approval, that they built exactly this and would feel right at home. It's a lovely thought, and it's an anachronism. The men of the 1780s lived in a world almost unimaginably distant from ours. No electricity, no telegraph, no photographs. A journey from Boston to Philadelphia took days. Their assumptions about who could vote, who counted as a citizen, what a woman's life was, what government could reach into, all of it was shaped by a vanished 18th century world. They disagreed furiously among themselves about what they were even making. To imagine they'd survey modern America and simply approve is to flatten them into mascots. The truer thing is gentler and stranger. They'd be astonished, baffled, delighted, and appalled, probably all at once. They were building for a country they couldn't see. Number 96. There's a habit of sorting the founders into two tidy bins. The cold secular skeptics who wanted religion nowhere near government, or the devout Christian statesmen founding a holy nation. Pick a side, and there's a founder to prop it up. The trouble is that neither caricature survives contact with the actual men. Their beliefs ran across the whole spectrum. Franklin and Jefferson leaned toward deism, doubting miracles and the divinity of Christ while still valuing religion's usefulness. John Jay was a serious, orthodox Christian who helped found a Bible society. Washington kept his faith private and conventional and mostly to himself. Adams drifted toward Unitarian views. They argued, they doubted, they attended different churches or none. What they largely shared wasn't a single theology, but a wariness of any one church wielding state power, many of them remembering exactly what established religion had done in the countries their families fled. Uniformity is the one thing they didn't have. Number 97. The idea that the founders meant the Constitution to stand fixed forever, perfect, finished, untouchable, a sacred text to be preserved exactly as written. It's a strange thing to believe about them, given that they built the machinery for changing it directly into the document. Article 5 lays out, in plain language, how to amend the Constitution, and they clearly expected it to be used, because it was used almost immediately. The Bill of Rights arrived as 10 amendments in 1791, barely 2 years in. And Jefferson went further than most. In a famous 1789 letter to Madison, he mused that the earth belongs always to the living, and wondered aloud whether each generation ought to revisit its own laws and constitution rather than be ruled forever by the dead hand of the past. Madison thought that went too far. But the point stands. The men who wrote it did not imagine they'd written scripture. They'd written a framework, and left the door open for those who came after. Number 98, and it's the one the whole video is built on. The phrase itself. Founding Fathers, surely that came from their own time. Surely they called themselves that, or their grateful contemporaries did. They didn't. The term would have puzzled them. For well over a century, Americans spoke of the framers, or the fathers, or the patriots of '76, but the specific ringing phrase Founding Fathers doesn't appear until the 20th century, and we can name the man who popularized it. Warren G. Harding, then a senator from Ohio, used it in a 1916 speech, and kept using it right through his presidency. It caught on and it stuck, and within a generation it sounded so timeless that everyone assumed it was. So the label we hang on Washington and Franklin and Jefferson, the words that frame every schoolbook chapter about them, were coined by a president most people would struggle to place. History does love its small ironies, and that leaves number 99, the last one, and maybe the quietest. The assumption that there is an official list, a fixed roster of the founding fathers, agreed upon and closed, names carved in a definite order. There isn't, there never was. No document names them, no authority ratified a list, and historians have never fully agreed on who belongs. The famous handful are safe enough: Washington, Franklin, Jefferson, Adams, Madison, Hamilton, Jay. After that, it blurs. Do you count everyone who signed the Declaration? Everyone at the Constitutional Convention? What about the ones who shaped it all and signed nothing? Thomas Paine, whose pamphlet lit the fire, the women who ran farms and businesses and correspondence while the men were away, the enslaved and free Black Americans who fought and wrote and pressed the country to mean what it said. Every list leaves someone out. The forgotten founders outnumber the remembered ones. The membership was never settled. It's still being argued, gently, to this day. And that feels like the right place to let all of this rest. Because if you've stayed with me through all 99, the thing you're left holding isn't a torn-down monument. It's something better. The real founders were stranger than the legend, and more human and far more contradictory, men who doubted and quarreled and changed their minds, who got things wrong, who wore their own hair and ached in their teeth and disagreed with each other about nearly everything, including what they were building. They weren't marble. They were people doing something difficult and unfinished, and mostly making it up as they went. There's a comfort in that, I think. We tend to imagine the past was surer of itself than we are. It wasn't. It never is. So if you're still awake, thank you for keeping me company through all of it. And if you'd like more calm history to drift off to, you're always welcome to subscribe. No rush, whenever it suits you. For now, though, there's nothing left to do but let the lights go low and let these restless, contradictory, deeply human men fade back into the quiet. Sleep well. Good night.